Let's talk about parasites. So we had just left off finishing our discussion about predation. And remember, predation and parasitism are closely linked. But there are a few unique things about parasites that I do want to talk about. And so that's what the remainder of this unit's going to be. I may go through and slim this down after I get back to my office. Or I may just slim down later units so we can get caught back up and you guys can start your projects on time. But we're going to go through whatever we get through today. So one of the first things we're going to talk about is parasite host specificity. So one of the things that we had said was not largely common about predators was predator pickiness. Right? It did exist, and that was one of the things that supported Logca volterra, but it wasn't super common. In parasites, however, more commonly is that parasites are picky. Now, that being said, we have two different types of parasites. Most of us tend to think of microparasites when we think of parasites, right? Things that are microscopic. This is often things like bacteria or cyst-like parasites, right? The kind that you end up with in your brain or in your tissue one way or another. But there are also macroparasites. There aren't a ton of those that affect humans, but these would be things like hookworms. Some maggots fulfill this category, and most arthropods and insects that are parasites fulfill this category. Right? So there are a few that fulfill this, right? That actually affect humans, but there are many that attack each other that fulfill this. So if we focus on the microparasites, we can really start to disentangle this parasite host specificity. So most of the time, hosts are attacked by multiple species of parasites. Right? If we think about just humans, right, we get attacked by all sorts of stuff. Right? We have hookworms, nematodes, and multiple species of bacteria. We can get all sorts of diseases. Right? These are all different species of parasites. That's what this first bullet is talking about. And often, one thing we forget here is even parasites have parasites. Right? So humans can get parasitized by the mosquito. Right? The female mosquito is a type of parasite. The mosquito, right, can thus be parasitized by forms of bacteria. Right? Like stages of the malaria bacteria, which then can also get passed on, which is so fun. Okay. So this becomes very meta, right? Parasites within parasites. Okay. So while hosts can have multiple parasites attacking them, sometimes at the same time, oftentimes many parasites are specialized. They may only attack a handful of hosts. Okay. So this is why things like the flu are such a big deal. It's like when bird flu was such a big deal, right? So it's uncommon. It's uncommon for parasites, right, to be able to switch or jump hosts. Right? So for example, with bird flu, right, most of the time, right, it's just sitting in those species of birds. Same thing with swine flu. Mostly just found in domesticated pigs. was like a random chance mutation that caused it to jump into humans that year. And if you're just a little young, but I think you were around when that happened. Right? It wasn't that long ago. So most of the time, these parasites are fairly specialized. Now, there are a handful that aren't. Right? We think a mosquito will pretty much drink anything that's got blood in it. Okay? But oftentimes, it has a limited number of hosts. Okay? So that way, most parasites aren't competing for the same host. Okay, so we're reducing competition. This also ensures, for the most part, this single host doesn't end up with an overly large parasite load. So remember when we first started talking about this, that unlike predators, the thing that makes parasitism different is that the goal of the parasite is not to kill its host, right? Because that means the parasite also dies, which is generally bad. Now, there are some exceptions to this, and we'll talk about some cool ones. But even then, they want to control the death of the host. And so overloading the host with a parasite load accidentally, right, particularly by having multiple species dragging it down, is not beneficial. Okay? Unlike a predator who's sort of fine with having 12 lions on top of a giraffe, right? So specialization helps with this and also tells us why there's such a large diversity. Okay. So as we look at the graph we have here, okay, we see our independent variable is number of parasite species per host. In this case, we're talking about an individual within the group. How many different species can there be, even at a given time? If we're just going to ignore the tree, plants are obnoxious. Okay. But if we think about most organisms here, we find that generally, right, we have a lot of specialization. Right? There aren't even that many species that can get on there, right? For fish, it's very low. But even for mammals, which is the highest, there's 15-ish species on average, depending on the mammal. Okay. Right? That can infect and siphon some kind of nutrient from that host. Why do we think plants have much higher loads? So some of it is size and age, right? If you have something like a giant oak, right? Some of these large trees that live a very long time, they can take on several different species at once and be okay sometimes, right? Particularly if we think of things that we forget are parasitic, like ivy. Right? Those are not probably going to kill or even make a big difference. Mistletoe, also parasitic. Okay. So the only thing that really tends to take down plants are fungal infections, like blights, what we tend to call them. That's going to take down a tree just as easy as it can take down a corn crop. But unless you get something like that, most of the time, plant stands can handle a little bit. Because remember, These organisms are always regrowing, right? They're much larger, they're much longer lived for the most part, although not exclusively. And we have a lot more diversity as well. And even if blight, for example, is taking over a cornfield, right, and wipes it out, right, this regrowth factor makes a big difference as far as plants go as well. Okay. We're good? Not going too fast? We're good? All right. So let's look at some other ways that we can define parasites. So ecto and endo. So literally ecto meaning out, endo meaning in. Okay. So here we want to think about how are the parasites accumulating their nutrients. Okay, so ecto being on the surface. This might be something like a mosquito or ivy. I'm going to be on the outside. I'm going to penetrate through and consume. Okay. Endoparasites, okay, are on the inside of their host. So this is going to be a lot of bacteria, tapeworms, okay, those sort of businesses. Okay. Now there is one other term that exists, and that's this hemiparasitic. So think hemi like hemisphere, right, like half. So there are a handful of organisms like the mistletoe, also like ivy, for that matter, okay, that are hemiparasitic organisms. Okay, so they are parasitic. Okay, so they're extracting nutrients from their host, okay, or tissue or something. But they're also gaining nutrients on their own. Right? So in the case of things like mistletoes and ivies, they're also photosynthesizing. Right? So they are not completely reliant on their host. They're supplementing their host's food, right, with their own. Okay, so a mistletoe or an ivy is both an ectoparasite and a hemiparasite. Right? It lives on the outside of its host, right, clinging or grafted onto branches and trunks, okay, puncturing its host and consuming nutrients that way. But it's hemiparasitic because it's also making its own food as well as a supplement. And so we have a lot of different terms that we can use. So mistletoe, for example, we have ectoparasite, hemiparasite, and macroparasite. Right? All three of those terms are appropriate because it's also large. So good? Nice to have terms that are at least semi-intuitive. Okay, so let's think about ecto and endoparasites and go through a few examples, right? So when we think about ectoparasites, okay, most fungi are ectoparasites, right? These stay on the outside of organisms, right? When you pick up fruit and vegetables, right, you can see the spores, okay? Those are all ectoparasitic. Okay, the hyphae, okay, stuff that pierces through, is what's going inside and pulling the nutrients out. Okay? Most of the things that bug us, okay, fleas, mites, lice, ticks, bed bugs, maybe assassin's bug. Okay, all of these organisms that bother you and I, our cats and dogs, these are all ectoparasites, right? They're sitting, this poor little guy's having a bad day, right? They're sitting on the surface. These are mice. They're hanging out. They usually have some kind of clampers. Okay, and all of these organisms, fungi, fleas, mites, they have some kind of piercing ability to get through your flesh. Okay, like you imagine a mosquito, but sized and specialized for whatever organism it is. Okay. As we talked about with the mosquito, but is true as well if we think about things like ticks. Okay. Parasites can also transmit endoparasites. Okay. So these ectoparasites also have parasites. They can transmit those around. Right, so for example, if your cat has fleas and eats those fleas, your cat can get tapeworms. Super fun. But this is also how you get Lyme's disease, right? You get bitten by a tick, you've been bitten by an ectoparasite, and has passed on an endoparasite to you. Hooray! That's how we get malaria and Zika, right? You've been bitten by an ectoparasite and you've had an endoparasite passed along to you. Yellow fever, all of that business. Same sort of dealio, right? So our endoparasites end up in different parts of the body. Okay, most of the time, okay, in portions of the digestive tract. Or somewhere in the small intestine. The goal, remember, is not to actually destroy the host, okay, but rather to steal from the host. Because we don't want the host to die. That's usually incidental. Often happens after a long enough infection, right, or a high enough load. But their goal is just to use the host. Right? So I'm taking nutrients from that host. So it's actually rare that the parasites are going through and actually breaking down tissue from their hosts. Okay, so your tapeworm, should you have one, isn't actually going through and munching away your tissue. It's just hanging out, sticking to the wall, and feeding on whatever you're feeding. You're not actually getting any of the nutrients you're eating, or you're getting a small proportion. Fundamentally, this is the same with ectoparasites, right? Now, they are injuring you, usually by piercing some point of flesh. It's rare you know, right? Like if you get poked by a mosquito, it hurts a little or it itches, but it's not like you're dissolving your skin, right? They're mostly trying to rob you of your nutrients, a little bit of blood. Right? And so they want the vitamins and the liquid that's in there. But they're not tearing down your flesh. They're not eating your meat, right? That's not their goal. And that's the same with any ectoparasite as well. They're going to take a little bit, lymph or blood, whatever it is, but their goal is not to actually consume your flesh or tissue. Any questions about this? Make sense? Okay, so now we're going to go through the same kind of topics that we talked about with predation. offense and defense, which is going to mirror capture and avoidance, right, just from a parasitism standpoint. Okay. And then we're going to look at these three topics, so population dynamics, community change, and then this arms race concept, which is going to, again, sort of bring up your project that's coming up. And the very last thing we're going to talk about, which I'm going to keep and if it kills me, which is enslavement, just because it's really cool, and it's a parasitism only thing. I like keeping the fun stuff, so we're going to keep it. All right, so let's look at offense and defense. Okay. So we want to think about, again, in the same way we thought about capture and avoidance from the predator and prey standpoint, okay, how can we look at offense and defense from the parasite and host standpoint? Okay, so if we're going to defend against getting a parasitic infection, okay, particularly if we're thinking about actually being able to enter in the first place, okay, there are a couple of major pieces. Certainly, just protecting from entry at all, right? And so, for example, right, bacteria can't generally enter our skin in the first place, bacteria and fungi. That's the whole goal of having skin. Okay? And most organisms, be it animal or plant, have some kind of protective layer. Okay? If something gets in, these next two things come into play. Having some kind of immune system, which is largely mammalian, as well as symbionts. Okay? So other organisms, so for example, our stomach has a lot of symbiotic bacteria, a lot of insects have a lot of symbiotic bacteria and organisms that will support and attack things that don't belong in there, or also consume them. Okay. We know with plants in particular that their root systems tend to create antimicrobial or antifungal compounds. This can help to prevent these types of things from even getting sort of within the space around you, which is nice. Okay. As well as regulating our biochemistry. Okay. So this is what I have down here. And so, for example, we have proteins that can remove parts from our blood and stores it away. Okay. So, for example, we remove the iron from our blood. Okay. This is what certain parasites want, like mosquitoes, for example, or the assassin's bug, the kissing bug. And so if our body recognizes that these are around, right, or if we've gotten treatment, okay, your body can kick up and do this, and it will reduce your, what's the word I want? Attractiveness, what I want, to these sorts of organisms. So any of these things, or sometimes any combination of these things, can help reduce the likelihood of parasites infecting you. But just like before when we talked about predators, right, and prey, we don't want to invest in the perfect armor, because then you're not investing in yourself, right? So the other thing we do, right, is treat yourself. The humans are a little luckier in this event, right, in that we actually have anti-parasitic medications. But these things also exist in nature. So for example, woolly bear caterpillars will actually poison themselves lightly poison themselves, right? With hemlock, okay, it's sort of one of those classic witches' deadly nightshade type plants. Okay, when one of those parasitic flies have laid eggs on their bodies. Okay, so basically what they're doing is making their blood and their urine slightly toxic, okay, which will exude through moisture in their skin, causing the eggs to fall off or making them, again, distasteful, reducing the chance that those parasitic flies are going to want to eat them. Now, what as a parasite can you do to live your best life here? We call these counter defenses, or being on offense, depending on how you want to look at this. Okay, so generally speaking, and one thing we know about a lot of our major diseases, like the flu, or things like HIV, is as these viruses or bacteria diseases do change a lot. And so the proteins, and the problem is, right, is these proteins vary a lot from organism to organism and from year to year. And so it is difficult for the body of these organisms to actively detect them as a problem until it's too late. So there isn't antibodies built up against them. The parasites get away with a lot anyway. And it's the same for any sort of parasite, right? The natural diversity that they're already getting, thanks to meiosis, is extraordinarily helpful, because some of the diversity they're getting is in their proteins. And the more diversity that you have in the protein, right, the harder it is for the body that you're attacking to recognize you immediately, and that lag time is valuable. Okay. For an ectoparasite, you're not going to be there permanently anyway, right? So a couple minutes is all you need before that immune system figures out what you are. Okay. And for an endoparasite, any lag time is still helpful anyway for you to do whatever it is you do, right? Because then you've mounted a large enough attack to create your own salvation or attack back, right? Now the other thing, or some other things, right? Remember, these are not complete lists. Organisms can do. So one thing that is really common is endoparasites, or eggs, or things that end up in the body, get what's called encapsulated. In other words, white blood cells, or versions of white blood cells, will attack, and often they're not able to kill, but they'll surround the foreign body and then basically flush themselves out of the system. Beautiful self-sacrifice. And so what they end up doing is avoiding this encapsulation by injecting. So if I'm laying multiple eggs, I'm going to inject several of the eggs with a virus-like particle. So some of those eggs then will self-destruct, killing a bunch of the white blood cells. Those then die, taking all those white blood cells with them. It leaves the other eggs to survive. Right, so then you have two different types of cells. Only the one cell is recognized as bad because it's recognized as a virus. So the white blood cells only attack that. And is leaving the eggs alone. They get to hatch and do all sorts of terrifying things. Sneaky little jerks. And so wasps and flies are commonly doing this sort of thing. Okay, remember, not a complete list, okay, but general strategies. Any questions so far? I'm not going too fast, right? Okay, so let's talk about the arms race idea. We talked about this in passing a little bit when we talked about predator and prey. So in general, when we talk about an arms race, we sort of mean this in the same way we mean that we talk about a human's perspective, right? It's literally a race to be better than whatever's trying to kill you. So we thought about it from the predator-prey perspective. My predator is getting better at hunting. I need to get better at not dying. So that's what we mean by an arms race. So my predator is getting an adaptation for seeing at night. Okay, there's now natural selection, right? Pressures for me to hide better or be quieter. Okay, so a new adaptation for something like that. So it continuously racing, right, from a proverbial standpoint, better weapons outdo each other. So it's the same thing from the parasite standpoint. Okay? So the parasites are going to get better adaptations at attacking, right, clinging to or deriving nutrients from their host. Okay, so that's their arms race increase. And the host, then there's natural selection pressure to not die, right, or not get sick as appropriate. So some natural selection pressure then to not be infected by that parasite, right? Or their immune system then to defend against that parasite once it's in there. Or to critically think and recognize the treatments against those parasites. Okay, so we're talking about natural selection here, an arms race that drives evolution of both of them against each other. One to survive based on needing food, sustenance, and the other to survive because they're getting eaten. So if they don't evolve quick enough, so we can use this biocontrol, remember, using a biological agent to control a population. Okay, so we had an introduction of rabbits onto an island. Poor Australia's had a lot of that. Okay, unchecked because there were no predators. Okay, rabbits went haywire. This is a whole thing that happens a lot on islands. Okay, so this went on for a long time. There were a lot of rabbits, quite frankly. So ultimately, by 1950, so this is almost 100 years later, they decided to introduce a virus that was very zygomorph specific. So pretty much only rabbits and hares could get it. Okay. The rabbit population there had been isolated so long that they pretty much had defenses to nothing. No predators, there were no diseases there for the rabbits. It was a rabbit utopia. So as a result, they did not have any adaptations or defenses against this particular virus. So bye-bye bunnies. Now on a place like Europe, okay, where rabbits are common and commonly interact with this virus, do not see a death rate like that, right? So let's take a look at these graphs. Let's see if we get through them all. Otherwise, we'll start again at the end of the day. So let's just focus on graph A first. Okay. Let's take a minute and think about what is graph A telling me. Listen. All right, what's the take-home message from my graph A? Good. So my IV is number of epidemics. Okay, so literally times that you experience a disease, right? And a widespread disease. Okay, so something that's taken on the whole population, or a large proportion of the population, right? And here we have mortality rate, aka death percent. So what this is telling us is the more times that we have a vast disease spreading across the population, the lower our mortality rate. Now it takes a while, right? This isn't just once or twice. Right? Once or twice we have better than 80% mortality, which is pretty hardcore for bunnies. Okay, but after long enough, okay, we get this quite low. So having experience with the same types of organisms, right, parasites, over and over and over again, it allows their immune system at the population level to learn. Okay, so here we see that arms race. Okay, so the rabbits are evolving defense slowly, right? Okay, we will look at graph B when we come back. So hold that thought.